Welcome, everyone, and Happy New Year. Thank you for attending the first in a series of public events in 2024 by the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. I am Mark Rosell. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. We are very proud to host the Hayden Center. The Hayden Center, of course, honors its founder, General Michael V. Hayden, who has been on our faculty for 13 years. Tonight, it's a very impressive showing. We have over 350 people who have signed up from around the country and even internationally. Those who have registered come from 30 states and the District of Columbia, 14 countries, 5 continents. Very impressive. And I especially would like to thank and to welcome the prospective students from high schools throughout the Commonwealth and the nation who are attending tonight. We look forward, hopefully, to meeting you in person at George Mason University when we have our next event for the Hayden Center. So to welcome tonight's special event, I now turn to the director of the Hayden Center, Larry Feifer. Larry.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate the welcome and all the nice comments. For those who are not familiar with the Hayden Center, we were established to put a spotlight on intelligence and the role it plays in supporting policymakers. We do that largely through events like tonight's, featuring prominent experts in a variety of intelligence, national security subjects. If you want to know about these events first, go to our homepage, our website, Hayden Center, hayden.gmu.edu. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can sign up to get email notifications about these events. Tonight's event is on Zoom. It's also being live streamed on YouTube. So if for any reason you get tired of Zoom or you want to watch it on YouTube instead, feel free to go over to the Hayden Center YouTube channel. We will have time for questions tonight. If you are on Zoom watching us, use the Q&A box to ask your questions. We will be reviewing questions in the Q&A box. The chat box is there for you to chat to your heart's content with other people who are watching tonight's event, but we're not going to be looking there for your questions. So please put them in the Q&A box. If you're watching us on YouTube, use the live chat function and we'll monitor those for your questions as well. Keep your questions brief. Keep them in the form of a question, otherwise they probably won't get asked. And if you're a journalist, please let us know that you are a journalist and who you're reporting for. We'll mention that when we ask the question. So we have reached the 100-day mark since that brutal attack by Hamas against Israeli civilians on October 7th, 2023. Where do things stand after 100 days? Violence has expanded to different areas. We've had violence in Lebanon, Iraq. We've had vessels attacked in waters around the region. Other players are joining the fight, particularly Iranian proxy forces in the Levant and from Somalia. Attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq. So it raises the question, are we in or headed to a widespread conflagration in the region? And what about terrorist threats against U.S. and its interests elsewhere from Palestinian forces, Iranian proxies, and others? How successful are U.S. diplomatic efforts? How successful are now U.S. military efforts been to try to contain that violence? At the outset of this situation back in October, we invited former intelligence agency leaders to discuss the conflict. If you've not seen that, it's available in our YouTube channel. Great video. John Brennan, General Hayden, Michael Morrell, having a conversation in the early days of the event. Tonight, however, we're going to bring together 3 former CIA experts who have decades studying and working with the players in the region. Our moderator for tonight is Michael Morrell. Michael's a senior counselor at Beacon Global Strategies, a risk management consulting firm. He hosts their podcast, Intelligence Matters, The Relaunch. It's available wherever you find your podcast. It's probably one of the best podcasts out there on national security and intelligence, so I encourage you to listen to it. Michael, for those who don't know, was Deputy Director of CIA from 2010 to 2013, acting director twice during that tenure in 2011 and in late 2012, early 2013. Capping his 30-year agency career. He's the author of a book, The Great War of Our Time, CIA's Fight Against Terrorism from Al-Qaeda to ISIS. And Michael's been a great friend of the Hayden Center for over 5 years. Our panel members, we feature tonight Emile Nakhleh. Emile is a former CIA senior intelligence officer. He was the founding director of the Political Islam Strategic Analysis Program Office and director of Regional Analysis Issue in the Middle East Division. As I was talking earlier in some private introductions, Emile is one who has briefed presidents and leaders and congressional members on these subjects for many years, and they've all learned something from him. More recently, he served as director of the Global and National Security Policy Institute at the University of New Mexico, and he's joining us from New Mexico. He is a consultant, and he has published books and articles on related topics, including an article that appeared yesterday and today in the Cipher Brief. Go to cipherbrief.com if you'd like to take a look at that article. It focused on this very issue. Secondly, we have Norman Roule. He's a repeat Hayden Center offender. He has been to, I think this is your third or fourth event. I've lost count. A former CIA senior operations officer. He capped his career as the National Intelligence Manager for Iran at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, serving from 2008 to 2017, advising our presidents and policymakers on intelligence associated with Iran and whether how their policies might actually work or not. He's in his CIA career, he managed numerous programs relating to Iran and the Middle East. He, as Michael Morrell joked earlier, is our case officer on the ground. He's actually joining us from the Middle East, where it is in the wee hours of the morning, and really appreciate you joining us at this late hour, Norm. He's an energy and geopolitical consultant to many players in the region. He's an advisor to several organizations, including CSIS's Transnational Threats Project, the organization United Against a Nuclear Iran, and an advisor to the Counter-Extremism Project. He also publishes pieces and appears on network and cable TV shows. And thank you, Norm, for joining us. Lastly, but not least, we have Rodney Snyder. Rodney is also a former CIA senior officer. He served as a chief of station in the region. He also, other key jobs he's had included being chief of staff to Director David Petraeus. He was a special assistant to President Obama for intelligence programs. He was an assistant commissioner at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Organization, and he is currently a partner at Guidehouse, a consulting firm working all kinds of security issues. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Michael to begin our discussion, and thank you all for joining us.
Larry, thank you for that warm introduction. It's great to be back at the Hayden Center. It's great to be doing another Hayden Center event. Larry, thank you for mentioning the podcast. I would just tell people, if you want to get to the podcast, you have to search Intelligence Matters, the relaunch. If you just search Intelligence Matters, you won't find the new feed. So Intelligence Matters, the relaunch. Norm, Rodney, Emile, great to see you all. Great to have you here. I can't imagine more expertise on the Middle East than we have with you three. So I'm really excited about tonight. Thank you very much. So let's get right to it. I want to start by asking about the psychologies, the psyche of the key players, right? Their fears, their anger, their hopes. What's in their mind? What's in their heart? What are they thinking about? What's driving them? What are they now? How have they changed since October 7th and the Israeli response to October 7th? And for the Israelis and the Palestinians, how do they get beyond where their psyches are today? Which I think, is going to be a critical variable going forward here. So Rodney, let me start with you and really ask you to talk about the Israeli psyche here. You know the Israelis well, spent a lot of time working with them. What do you think?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to be here, and terrific to be at George Mason University with General Hayden, Larry, Mark, and then this august crew of these three individuals. So thank you. Michael, thanks for asking this question about the Israeli psyche, because I think it's deeply enmeshed in what sort of happens now. And from my perspective, as I've been thinking about it, over the sort of weeks and now months since October 7th, I think there's sort of three dynamics that are at play. One is this sort of everyday, trauma. And I'll talk sort of more about that in just a minute. Another is sort of these shattered expectations. And then the third is real anxiety, real stress, real trepidation of what's next. So let me go through all three of these very, very quickly. So first, sort of the everyday trauma. A lot of people here probably are seen, newscasts, videos, photos of people suffering sort of ferocious violence and unimaginable loss. And it's for, several minutes each day. And then by and large, it sort of fades. But for the Israelis, they are in some ways not only still reeling from and living every day, sort of with October 7th and its aftermath psychologically, but it's all over them. It's just, it's incredible. And so everywhere they turn, the internet, the TV, the radio, social media, when they're out on the street, billboards and posters, people are wearing, shirts that have pictures of the hostages. When they're at work, they're empty seats, some because people are no longer with us, some because, these are reservists who have been, called up. But the bottom line is this daily sort of constant. It's ubiquitous. It's always present. And then that's sort of on top of that is the violence in the West Bank and up in the north, the mounting casualties, in Gaza, the rallies, the demonstrations, certainly around the hostages, the politics, if you're worked on Israel at all, the politics, and just the horrible sort of aftershocks, every day. And I'm no psychologist, but to your question, Michael, on sort of the psyche, my sense is that there's just virtually no escape. And so the searing effects for many are really raw. And that's important to the second part of your question about, so, what happens? How do we get from where we are now to a different place? The second basket I sort of mentioned was this, shattered expectations. I mean, for a lot of Israelis, to this day, it's still sort of the crushed this image of as the Israelis knew it and understood it. And so, it's not to say the Israelis aren't finding their way back. They are, they will. But it is to say that sort of this proud, people, this very sort of strong nation have been shaken to the core. And there's a depth here that many of you, especially those who sort of have worked and know the Middle East, really understand. But there are many non-Israelis who don't sort of get the depth of this. And that is, Israel, as all of you know, is founded on the ashes of the Holocaust. It's born from the promised future of never again. And so, I can remember specific instances. When I went into the prime minister's private office for the first time, he had a pedestal and was dedicated to holding one book. And that book, by the way, was about 6 inches, thick. And all it was, small little words, line after line, page after page, all the way through. And it's the names of all 6 million Jews killed during the Holocaust. And that was sort of, very significant sort of place in the room. By the way, the same thing, very similar, happened when I went to the defense minister's, office for the first time. Large picture framed on the wall. It was the only one. And it was a photo looking into and through the front gate of Auschwitz. And he didn't have it behind him. He had it in front where he could see it. So I give these examples because, that book and that picture, these weren't decorations. These sort of give you a sense of how deep this strain of never again, runs. It's just in Israelis' hearts, minds, DNA, their souls. And so I just think it's really sort of important to sort of really understand that mindset. And then, comes October 7th. The worst one-day massacres of Jews since the Holocaust, of Israelis in its 75 history. And it's not just that. We're not going to relive it, but the IDF didn't come for hours to the rescue. No one stopped those who had been kidnapped from being swooped into Gaza, some being paraded around, and then being stashed in the Hamas's hideouts. And so the gruesome evil is too much to describe. But when you mix all this together, it causes sort of this breakdown, this sort of mental, psychological, just, a shock of what was expected, but what, really is. And so there's much more too, because the bottom line is 100 days may have passed, but it's not over. It's the reckoning and soul searching continues. And then the final thing, Michael, and then I'll stop is, look, there's this tangible sort of alarm, this trepidation that the other shoe, but it's not just a shoe, it's shoes, are still to drop. So everything, every day there's something new. There's some issue that raises tensions and stress. There's an anxiety in the air. And for those who have lived there, that it's a tense security society. So you feel that even more than in other places. But right now it's heavy. And so again, as spirited and tough and resilient as Israel is, there's this sense that bad things are still looming. And so just this past weekend, since this weekend, Lebanese Hezbollah has killed another Israeli or Israelis in the north. Hamas has fired more rockets in Israel, if you can believe it, given the siege that's occurred, proclaimed, more hostages have been killed. IDF soldiers have died in operations in Gaza. Iran has fired on an alleged Mossad base in Erbil. Iran's Islamic resistance in Iraq has fired on Eilat, which is Israel's southern port. And the list just goes on and on. And so most people know, as an example, that the Hamas's destructive capabilities don't hold a candle to Lebanese Hezbollah's. So the reason I sort of say all this is because I really want everyone to get a sense, in response to your question, Michael, about this sort of psychological, this sort of situation that's hanging in the air, over everyone, and some of the many other elements that I haven't mentioned that are just really sort of giving a frustration, a sadness, but also an anger, a charge within Israel over everything that's happening both at home and abroad, and it's sort of leaving this feeling that whatever comes next, we have to sort of get on top of it. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Rodney. That's sobering. Emile, can you talk about the Palestinian psyche? Here I mean Palestinian civilians, wherever they are.
Yeah.
How is their psychology?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this great program. I think we have to look at the Palestinian psychology over time, not since October 7, but really since the 67 war. And I've been going there every 10 years to do research exactly about this issue among the Palestinians, both the West Bank and Gaza. And every 10 years, I would do some research and look at some public opinion polls. And from decade to decade, I discovered that the situation gets worse and worse for the Palestinians themselves. So the first point I would make is that Palestinian psychology in both areas, the West Bank and Gaza, is to a large extent colored by their immediate situation. So in 87, I went in there on a Fulbright at Hebrew University, but I did research in the West Bank and Gaza. And I wrote an article as a result of that in the Middle East Journal in the spring of 88 about exactly this very point. And I summarized the psychology of the Palestinians as follows with these words. And those words were correct in 88, and they are getting worse today, according to public opinion polls. And so there is overcrowding. There's humiliation. There's humiliation almost every single day in their daily lives as they try to cross borders, as they try to cross the entrance into Israel, as they travel between cities. And this humiliation has driven their anger and their resentment of their situation. So there is tremendous frustration. There is tremendous, and more recently, by the way, they have not only experienced the violence from the Israeli military, but more recently is from the settlers. Under the new government, the settlers have been truly harassing and inflicting violence on Palestinians every single day. We don't see much reporting on it in our media, but the reality is that these settlers go into a town, they like a house, they take the house. They like a piece of land, they take the piece of land, and the army protects them. So there's this sense of humiliation. So that was up till the Intifada. Now, after the Intifada, they developed this sense, oh my gosh, we can do something about it. We can face down the occupation through this word, which they constantly repeat, is called sumud, or steadfastness, that despite of everything that happens to them, they are staying there. And so the settlers are trying to uproot them with tacit support from this present government in particular. And that is in the West Bank. In Gaza, even though Israel, of course, the Israeli occupation was removed theoretically in the mid-90s, but the reality is the only state, the only authority that exists today and 20 years ago in the West Bank and Gaza has been the Israeli authority. And the Palestinians, I would go, to some villages and talk to just individual people about not the Israeli military, but how does the occupation affect them in their daily lives? And the stories are phenomenal, just on a daily basis. So they have these views among the majority. The elites, a few elites that are doing very well, have managed to create wealth, really, even under the occupation. The average person, their attitude toward their own life, it has changed considerably. It's one of control by somebody else. The future for their children is totally unclear. As one Palestinian farmer told me, I want to get a generator to raise cucumbers. I cannot, because I cannot get the authorization from the occupation to buy a new generator. And so their daily lives are affected. A librarian cannot get the books to the library on time because of that occupation. So this feeling of subjugation almost, it creates anger, it creates frustration, and really turns to violence as the only way out. And in fact, the most recent polls from there shows why they tremendously respect what Hamas did in Gaza, not because they support Hamas. Majority actually of Palestinians in the West Bank tend to be, I hate to use the phrase, secular as compared to Islamists, and they don't necessarily like Hamas as a governing institution, but they like what Hamas did because it expresses their frustration, knowing very well that Hamas is not going to win in the end. And in the end, we will come to your next question about winners and losers. And the losers are the Palestinian people. In all of this is not Israel, is not Hamas, is not us, is the Palestinian people, with all the casualties, the destruction, and the need to rebuild. So this frustration is there, and I think it would behoove us to begin to think about the actual people on the ground, not Abbas in Ramallah. They view Mahmoud Abbas as a corrupt, repressive regime in Ramallah. That's one point. The second point, the attitude toward Abbas is that he basically does Israel's bidding for Israel and doesn't really serve the West Bank. And that's one reason why Abbas has not allowed any elections, because he knows if there are elections, Fatah, his party, would lose. And not because they like Hamas, but because they are faced with a corrupt regime in Ramallah and repressive regime in Gaza. And so that colors their psychology across.
Yeah. Norm, maybe you can handle two groups for us here, and maybe it's less psychology and more mindset with these two groups. But the two groups are the Sunni Arab countries, both the leadership and the so-called Arab street, the citizens of those countries, and then the second group would be Iran and proxies. How would you characterize the mindset of both of those groups in terms of where we are now?
Each of these countries, each of these groups are impacted by their prevailing ideologies and the prevailing narratives in their media and put forward by their governments. But we're watching people in the Middle East, the Sunni states, the moderate Sunni states are on the cusp of tremendous transformations that will act as an engine of progress and social liberalization if it succeeds over time, and will help the broken states of the region and the failing states. But this is now a significant challenge. With Iran, this is a significant achievement because it actually operationalizes the many pieces it has placed on the chessboard for a while. I'd like to touch very briefly on what Emile and Rodney have stated is there is we're in an initial or even intermediate stage at best of a trauma that is transforming two generations of people who already have very different histories and perspectives of each other. They're going to have to get through this trauma very differently with two political systems that are not necessarily going to be very conducive to progress in the near term. If you're the Iranians, that's a great situation to deal with because, in essence, you've got the Netanyahu government denying a Palestinian state. You have Hamas saying, we're going to do it again. You have Abu Mazen incapable of offering good governance and suffering both obviously in Palestine, it's the most extreme. We shouldn't discount that there are more than 120,000 Israelis who have been moved from their homes, and the trauma of October 7th has transformed a generation, to include the generation fighting in Palestine. This indicates that you're going to have months of operational opportunities for the Shia. But for the moderate Sunnis, they have to manage both their own street, which is watching not only daily deaths of Palestinian women and children, and uncurated social media sent out from Gaza by the Palestinians themselves. This is a critical issue that I think they're managing as well as possible. No one's really satisfied. But I think the final message I'd put forward is we should be thinking about this in terms of process that will require months on all sides, and there's very little capacity of any single actor to control this. We're just going to have to sort of deal with this emerging situation to include the bad actions of Iran and its proxies.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys. That's great. Let me ask each of you, a simple question, but important question. In terms of the war in Gaza, who's winning, both militarily on the ground and then from the perspective of winning public opinion. So let's go in reverse order. Norm, let's start with you.
I think you have to decide how you measure winning. Israel has not freed the hostages. It has not yet killed Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif. It has destroyed a large portion of Hamas military capacity, hundreds of tunnels, thousands of tons of weapons, and it has killed probably north of 9,500 fighters, to include many of the people who were responsible for the massacre of October 7th. The public opinion within Israel remains difficult for the Netanyahu government. He failed on security, he failed on Iran, he failed on other issues that were prevalent before this. And within the Palestinian world, you have some indication when people are allowed to speak freely, they're angry against Hamas, but they're also in favor of Hamas showing its resistance, as Emile put. I think in essence, you have to say this war is going on. And one more twist, this is a 7-front war for Israel. And you have new players drawn in, not just the United States and naval actors from other places, but we've just seen Pakistan and Iran start to confront each other. So winning this war requires definition of what winning is, but also increasingly what the war is. And the Palestinian-Israel issue is at the heart of it, the heart and lungs of it, but it's not necessarily going to be the driver of some of the major problems for world leaders in the near term.
Yeah, Emile?
That's a very good question, Michael. The first point I would make is that we really have to focus only, at least in my judgment, on the short term, because beyond really the next 6 months, the whole picture will change. But in the short term, in light of October 7, I would say I would start with the losers, if you don't mind, and then I'll go to the winners. So I would say the first loser of October 7 is Netanyahu. The second, it seems to me, is our standing in the region, the Biden administration and our standing in the region. The third and most important are the Palestinians in Gaza. And the fourth would be the Arab-Jewish collaboration within Israel. Up till October 7, there has been a huge trend of Jewish-Arab collaboration in education, in civil society, in Israel, where you see Arabs, and that is Israeli Arabs, Palestinians in Israel, and Jews. That has stopped. The Arab-Israeli rapprochement for the time being has stopped. The PA in Ramallah has emerged as a loser. Hezbollah, in a sense, has emerged as a loser because it has been marginalized and embarrassed by what Hamas has done. They wanted Hezbollah to join, and Hezbollah, for their own reasons and Iran's reasons and Lebanon's reasons, decided not to, other than these on the border rather than a major confrontation. But I in terms of the winners, and I want to look at the most recent public opinion. I mean, we have our view from here as who is a winner and loser in the Middle East. But if I look at the most recent public opinion, Arab public opinion out of Doha, out of the institute at the university there, and it was done and published on the 10th of this month, so about eight days ago. And that public opinion, they asked these questions, and most of the responses showed that Hamas ended up as a winner. According to the public opinion and poll, and we have the percentages, they are viewed as a winner because they survived the Israeli assault for 3 months. And no one has probably initially expected them to survive. They are a winner, according to the poll, because they were able so far to halt that Arab, especially Saudi, potential rapprochement with Israel. That was really proceeding pretty quickly, and that action stopped that, at least in the short term. They are viewed, according to the poll, as a winner because they reinserted Palestine as an issue on the regional front and globally. And they said that was, and that more and more leaders now talk about a Palestine state, a state of Palestine, a Palestinian state. Even though Netanyahu today said, nope, they will not accept any Palestinian state. But this, we see our own president, our own secretary of state, the British leaders are all now talking about the need for a Palestinian state as going forward. And the public opinion poll credits that to Hamas, credit Hamas for that. And finally, the opinion poll showed that Hamas is a winner because they emerge as the only resistance force, if you will, not the PA, not the PLO, not other groups within the Palestinian community, but that Hamas. Again, that's only in the short term, that's only a moment in time, and the public opinion poll was done just over a week before it was published. So it's just a point in time, and I want to make that point that these comments really apply to the short term rather than the long term.
Yeah. Ronnie, anything to add?
Just a few things very quickly. I think, I put Iran in the winning column, unfortunately. I also think you really need to remember that China and Russia are probably looking at this, pretty favorably. It's nothing like having seen the U.S. distracted and battling, while Washington is being condemned across many parts of the globe for sort of helping Israel conduct its military campaign, even as our own president calls the Israeli attacks, indiscriminate. And as the U.S. continues to very publicly sort of insist that Israel move from high intensity to low intensity conflict and more surgical targeting. So I just think there's a lot of reasons why we can't forget that. I put the Israeli settlers, unfortunately, in that column. I think, and people are going to think this sounds wishy-washy, but it's not. I put sort of the issue of hate in that winning column, the sort of despicable rise and surfacing of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other hate, has really reared its ugly head in cruel ways, including here in the U.S. I think all the points that Emile made about Hamas is absolutely right. The one thing I'd say is I just, really feel strongly, though, that there are some others here. And when you start tallying it up, you sort of put Iran, Russia, China, Hamas, Iran's proxies, hate. If you were to add sort of an Israeli column there, the Israeli settlers on sort of one side, and on the other side, you put the civilian Palestinian population. You put, I think, in large part, the Israelis. You put the U.S. and I just think that while that's too black and white, and I like what Norm said about needing definition, if you were to sort of do that general sort of summary, that's not the way we want sort of any ledger to look. I'll stop there, Michael. Thanks.
Yeah. Let's shift to a very, very important question here, and that is the risk of the war spreading. Now, I know there is violence in a number of places, as Larry outlined at the beginning, but we're really talking here about that simmering, maybe a heavy simmer of violence in northern Israel, in Iraq and Syria, in the Red Sea, right? That simmering, really boiling over into significant violence between Israel and Hezbollah, possibly between Israel and Iran, possibly even between the U.S. and Iran. So that's what we're talking about in terms of this war spreading right into a regional war.
Yeah.
Very quickly, how do you each see the risks of that? Is it growing, and what will it turn on as to whether this simmering violence becomes, significant, nation state violence? Emile, let me start with you, and let's try to be brief here, okay?
Yeah. I think miscalculation is going to be the biggest factor in an expanding war. This is a type of regional war that no state wants to happen, yet a miscalculation could lead to a regional war. And I kind of, want to kind of grade them a bit in that there is high risk of war between Israel and Lebanon. But I think there is a lower risk of war between the US and Iran. A lower risk of war, all-out war between Israel and Iran. There is a high risk of the war expanding to Saudi if the Houthis, for example, begin to strike, and that worries me, begin to strike facilities in Saudi Arabia as they did in the past. They cannot perhaps strike American facilities as much, but they can strike Saudi facilities. And that ultimately, if that continues with Iranian support, then the risk of war between Saudi and Iran will go up. I expect that the risk of war could expand to Iraq as well. We already see strikes in Iraq by Iran, by Turkey in the north, by potential the US against elements in Iraq. So I think Iraq is almost a sleeping giant in this calculation about regional war. And I think the risk there is very high.
Yeah, Rodney, let me turn to you and let me change the question a little bit. Emile talked about the short term and talked about, his argument that we only get to a broader regional war through miscalculation. And what I want to ask you is, given the Israeli psyche that you eloquently outlined at the beginning, is there any possibility that for Israel, this becomes an intentional war at some point, that they conclude that they can no longer live with Hezbollah having 150,000, rockets, mortars, missiles, drones, a much more significant military capability, right? Is it possible that they come to the conclusion that they can no longer coexist with an Iranian revolutionary government? Is there a possibility here of Israel becoming the aggressor at some point?
Yeah, Michael, so I think you've hit it right on the head. I do completely take the point that Emile's made about sort of inadvertently, sort of walking your way into the war. But I take your point, and that's where I come out on this. I think, and have written and published this, the Israelis have made a decision, a lesson learned, whether we agree with it or not. And that lesson learned is they cannot have a force right on their border that is increasing its military capabilities, often at sort of the behest of Iran, is talking about, sort of no acceptance of it being there, of wanting to wipe it off the map, and having these capabilities that not only result in just unbelievable sort of death, but also incredible destruction, and increasingly so, every month, year, et cetera. I'm concerned that, Hezbollah and its refusal to move back, and it's not going to, several kilometers from the border with Israel. Just today, they rejected a plea from the U.S. Special Envoy to move back, 7 kilometers from the border because the U.S. is trying to attempt, preventing a wider war. And as Norm said, tens of thousands of Israelis have been, displaced from the north of the country. Members of a family were killed, as I mentioned earlier, by an anti-tank missile from Hezbollah just the other day. And so I think that you're already seeing that decision. It's been made. It's a matter of timing and not wanting to fight multiple wars on the sort of front at the same time. But just to give an example, the IDF chief of staff, and remember, he used to be the head of military intel and was supremely, worried even back then about Hezbollah's military capabilities. I mean, just, sort of exceptionally anxious about that. He essentially said recently that if Hezbollah doesn't sort of permanently move back from the Israeli border, then there will be war sooner or later. And in my mind, what he was implying is Israel will feel it has no option but to go to war to stop, sort of something like what Hamas did, but 1,000 times, bigger, stronger, worse from Hezbollah. And so I completely, sort of have an agreement with that view that they've already made a decision. They can't live with it. And it's a question of when, how, what action to take. Over.
Norm, you've thought a lot about this question. Can you comment on what you've heard?
In general, there are no strategic drivers for any of the main actors in the region to invite a conventional war because it would severely damage their political and economic ambitions and situations they're undergoing, from Lebanese Hezbollah, to Iran, to Israel, et cetera, et cetera. There are profound logistical challenges for this in terms of ordnance, weapons capabilities, public opinion, a variety of different pieces that go into all of this. There is, however, and by one visual aid, the level of violence, the intensity, and the type of weapons being used tends to increase as they go through perceived red lines, finding that they're pink, and that a level and nature of violence is normalized. Medium-range ballistic missiles and drones from Yemen. That's unheard of. And now it's not really front page news in terms of its attacks on the Israelis. It's more front page news on its attacks on international shipping. In general, with some exceptions, I see very little chance of miscalculation. This is an over-calculated environment. I do see some areas where miscalculation could take place. Iran and Pakistan, for example, that was not well thought out. However, at the same time, and I'll close with this, there is the potential of what I call a gravity sink issue developing. And that would be in the Red Sea, for example, a missile that strikes the bridge of a ship, leaves it in flames. It's on CNN. It blocks the Red Sea, or an oil tanker fills it with oil, shuts on all shipping. That's not calculated. That just happens, but it pulls in a lot of different behaviors. but the world has changed. And that means in the long run, we shouldn't expect the Iran's proxies to go away just because peace process begins. And Netanyahu must deal with returning 80,000 people to the north. And Lebanese Hezbollah has got to be pushed back in some way, let alone taking care of the poor people of Gaza, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that we're going to be event driven more than strategy driven.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's talk about the future of Gaza once the Israeli presence ends, because that's, I think, another critical issue. You know, who takes care of the very significant humanitarian needs of the Gazans? You know, everything from food, water, housing, healthcare. You know, who provides security? Who rebuilds the infrastructure? You know, who governs? And what happens, right, if none of that or not much of that actually gets done? You know, can this be solved with Netanyahu still in power? Can it be solved without the Sunni Arab states playing a significant role? So lots of questions here. Norm, let's start with you. I know you've thought a lot about this, and then we'll go to Rodney and Emile.
Well, the humanitarian issues will be solved, and it will be an international effort with European, some US, and Sunni Arab money. We're talking water, telecommunications, sewage, et cetera, et cetera. It takes very little wit or wisdom to say this needs to be done by these people. At the same time, if the process is not undertaken to restore peace, it's not reasonable to ask people to build something that in 3 weeks or 6 months is going to be destroyed, or that Hamas is going to use the water pipes for weapons or the cement for tunnels. That's a legitimate concern by the Israelis, and as we're seeing from the tunnels, there's a lot of that happened. So the process of how to get humanitarian aid in is happening right now, and it involves all the right players. But if I think that in some ways is the easy part. The hard part is how to create the conditions to allow this humanitarian aid and the months, if not years, it will take to rebuild sewage, water, electricity, telecommunications, to have this happen without, again, Hamas 2.0, ISIS seizing this and twisting it, and the Israelis, not unreasonably from their perspective, destroying a terrorist tool, and the Palestinian people suffering, and everyone else saying, why am I putting money into something that's being blown up in another conflict?
Rodney?
Yeah, so I'm going to sort of take this in two ways, Michael. First of all, it seems to me that a lot of people aren't really truly tracking the brink of disaster that we're on in Gaza to the fullest extent. I mean, based on, you know, if you sort of take the UN assessments sort of, you know, with accuracy, I mean, 7,000 to 8,000 children are so severely malnourished right now that they're at risk of death without immediate treatment. And the numbers are going to go up dramatically over the next 2 to 3 weeks, disease, things like that. So even if, you know, we sort of speculate, oh, there's going to at some point be an end to this, there's going to be all this sort of incoming aid, I just think it's going to get much, much worse before it, you know, gets better. And it's just horrific, you know. And I can just give you, I don't usually pay attention to numbers, but in this case, I mean, the numbers are just so telling. So that's one part, is we've got this humanitarian catastrophe. It's getting worse. It's probably going to be, you know, sort of over the edge soon where you can't pull it back. And it's going to be just a real calamity. The second part, more to your question and Norm's, you know, comments. Look, my sense is, while this sounds mechanics, it's not. You know, you're going to need wealthy Sunni countries and others, probably including the U.S., to donate money for the UN to come in and build these enormous tent cities, which are really refugee camps, to provide, you know, for the people of Gaza. And I mean, all the things that, you know, you and Norm just mentioned, from clean sanitation and water to medical care to everything else. And while that's happening, and by the way, the war has to stop first for that to occur, at least in any, you know, sort of genuine way. While that's happening, I think there's going to have to be an attempt to work through. I mean, you'd want it the other way around, but it's probably not going to happen. An attempt to work through, you know, how, when, who's going to rebuild. And I'm just not sure that any of this can truly sort of get underway in a substantial manner while both the current Israeli and Palestinian leaders are in place, and that means a lot of them. And while the situation is continuing to get so dire, that's why I started out with, you know, talking about this sort of, you know, tipping over the edge. And then finally, I'm not sure we can get over it for the reasons that Norm has mentioned, and because of that psyche. Going back to the first question you asked, we're just not there yet. So anyway, that's my answer. Is we got to figure out a way, but it's not looking, sort of at all right around the corner. Not looking positive.
Emile, you've written about this.
Well, to emphasize the point that Rodney just made, the war has got to end. That is the first point before we proceed. The second point is that, unfortunately, the Palestinians have experienced living as refugees in camps. They will endure more of that for the foreseeable future. But I think in reality, if we want to look at the future of Gaza, first, we cannot take it in isolation from the West Bank. That if you are going to look at the future of Gaza, you have to link it to the West Bank. The second is that the current leaders, in my judgment, cannot be part of the solution. I'm talking about Mahmoud Abbas in Ramallah, Netanyahu in Israel, and Sinwar and the leaders on the ground in Gaza. That is, these leaders cannot be part of the solution. They will not be part of the solution. So that's the other point that we have not touched on, is the schism inside Israel. I mean, Haaretz, and I read Haaretz daily, have already for several times now in their editorials called on Netanyahu to resign and declared Netanyahu as a failure and so on. So I think in post-Gaza, I don't think Netanyahu will be in position. In post-Gaza, I don't think Mahmoud Abbas will be in position to be part of a solution. So the political and economic approach should go together. I suggested in this article that came out today on the Cipher Brief that there should be both political sovereignty and economic sovereignty. And we are not talking about state sovereignty. We are talking about sovereignty for individuals and communities, Palestinian individuals and communities. This would be the first step toward living as sovereign people. I'm not talking about the two-state or whatever modality develops, but whatever modality, that there's got to be a way to provide sovereignty, security, economic opportunity for the two peoples between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That these two peoples are living there together. And ultimately, we have had examples in Israel and in the West Bank where cooperative arrangements have been made between Israelis and Palestinians. We need to resurrect that, but on kind of equal level. Economic projects, were discussed. 2 economic projects. I was involved in those discussions after the first Camp David. And one was a huge business in Gaza, supported by Gulf money, Israeli technology, that would work to develop agriculture and develop irrigation for Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians in the Dead Sea Valley. And that becomes the breadbasket for vegetables and fruits for the entire region. Desalination is already started, using Gulf money from UAE, Israeli technology, and Jordanian technology, and already providing desalination and irrigation. This program will employ thousands of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. So the two political and economic paradigms, if you will, the two legs of this paradigm have got to go together. And in the long run, you cannot really solve this issue without these two issues together.
Let's switch to some audience questions, and I might expand them a little bit as I go through them. But the first one is really about Israeli politics, Rodney. Netanyahu's political position. What does that look like? Emile, can you mute, please? Thank you. What does Netanyahu's political position look like? What's his staying power? What's likely to follow? Is it going to be, as right a government as we've had, over the past several years, or, or are we going to end up in a distant place? What do you think?
So thanks for the question. And I think this is really significant because, a few minutes ago, I talked about how current leaders are just not going to make it work. And then Emile, elaborated on that. So thank you for that. I think that Netanyahu, if you look at the polls, he is way, way down in the polls. And most people feel that he should leave. I will tell you, though, he's a fighter. He's been able to sort of come back and, reinvent himself and sort of somehow have this incredible sort of staying power. So let's not count him out yet, whatever one thinks. But I do, feel as though this time he's got a very, very sort of significant anchor around his neck, because here he's been, Mr. Security, no matter what else is happening. And yet, these events occurred on his watch. And look, it's important to recognize that it isn't just what happened on October 7th. If you look at the Israeli military now, no matter how terrific they may be in so many ways, they're not achieving their objectives. It's not just they haven't killed Sinwar and Mohammed Taif, as others mentioned. It is that Hamas is still firing rockets. It is that, we know that even if 9,000, and Norm, gave that figure, that's 1/3 of what was estimated by the Israelis to be the Hamas, fighting force. And so it's not over. It's not over yet. And so there's real pressure on him. And in fact, a lot of people, and I mentioned this earlier about this sort of reckoning, this sort of soul searching, what happens? When does he leave? When does, and when I say leave, I mean, get pushed out. When does, sort of the next chapter begin? And I mentioned one time, earlier, politics, because you're already starting to see this movement occur, even against this, horrific backdrop that is the war. And so a lot of this, Michael, comes down to what's going to be sort of this fight. And please don't forget that, there are already a lot of security officials who have, in essence, handed in their resignations. They will resign, especially at the military and intelligence levels. They will have to exit the government. They've already said that, but they're not doing it now because everybody knows, stick to the fight. Let's achieve our objectives. Then that will occur, just like the investigations of what happened. So there's a lot of parts that are still, to sort of find their place. And that's a part of what's making the sort of Israeli society as a whole so incredibly anxious. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Another question about Iran, and Norm, I'm going to pose this to you, obviously. It appears, right, at least on the surface, and you can set us right here, that almost all of this, and I don't mean the attack itself, but certainly Hamas's capabilities to a significant degree, all of this kind of goes back to Iran, right? The training, the money, the weapons that Hamas, showed us on October 7th, certainly Hezbollah's capabilities and its very existence go back to Iran. The Houthis, supplied by Iran, the Shia militants in Iraq, the same story. How come we're not hearing more about Iran, and do we need a new policy approach to Iran from the U.S. perspective?
Well, you have to be careful what you wish for. It's certainly true that there's very little surprising about this conflict. There was no reason to believe it would end quickly. There was every reason to believe it would take a long time. There was every reason to believe that the politics are going to be complicated. But there was also every reason to believe that Iran would seek to extend it. There's no question that Iran has been an enabler of this, but there are legitimate grievances among the Palestinian people and the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic that Iran just exploited. The bottom line is this: if you want to undertake an action against Iran, it requires a multilateral approach of diplomatic and economic isolation. Engagement has failed. And in fairness, it was something to offer, but it's become a religious issue in the United States and elsewhere. You're either for engagement, for JCPOA, or against it, et cetera, et cetera. But if we were in the private sector, the people who were involved in engagement with Iran would have been fired at this point because of what Iran did with the funds that came through engagement. And without going into details, I've watched engagement up close since the mid 1980s, and it's just not worked. But the problem is, if you want to take it to confrontation, that's not only just expensive. This consumes time, calendars, money, armies, reputations, political administrations. It requires boots on the ground. It requires the risk of another conflict, as Iran will push back and test our fortitude. Again, you need a multilateral approach to this. And I'll close by saying, within our own dynamic in the US, the issue of Iran, largely because of the politicization of JCPOA and the number of people who really landed religiously on one side or other of that, it's a very difficult issue that we have to get in order first. So I'll close with two comments. If you want to take on Iran, we need a bipartisan policy. And realizing that I'm not talking to the faithful here, most of the voices who were talking about Iran in the outside world have no clue about the real issues. They just have strong opinions, and it contaminates the zeitgeist of our politics. But we need a bipartisan solution that respects legitimate security concerns of people in the region, and it must involve the Europeans, and we must have some kind of a P5 approach to this too. This is hard. I don't see this happening in the near term. One final footnote. Anytime someone says we should strike Iran, you have to legitimately ask, does the president have the authority to begin what is in essence a war with another country? He has the authority to defend U.S. troops. He has the authority to act for 2 days before informing Congress. But if you send missiles into Iran, it's a legitimate legal question to say, is that not the right of Congress? How's Congress doing on Ukraine? How's it doing on Israel? These are real complications, and Iran hopes to exploit this. So we need to just have a real plan. My final line that I would close with is, we've kicked the can down the road on Iran, in part because of the many voices who pushed engagement, et cetera, or confrontation. But the road gets shorter with every kick, and the can gets heavier. We are now in a cul-de-sac with a 55-gallon drum of hardened cement, and there's nowhere else to kick the can. So we do need a policy solution on this. I'm not convinced it's coming.
Yeah, let me ask a follow-up from me. Is how much control do the Iranians have over the Houthis, Shia militants in Iraq, and Hezbollah?
Control is a very Western concept. It's a very bad question, because it puts it in the Western mindset of somebody has a hand on the lever.
My mind exists, but go ahead.
That's not how Iran works with proxies. Iran finds individuals with certain capabilities that can be expanded, who undertake activities that support Iran's ultimate goals. Iran may or may not be aware of the specific activities, but it makes them all possible. And many of those activities, which are lethal, would not be possible without Iranian support. Iran bears direct responsibility for Gaza, death of Palestinians, and death of Israelis. But control itself is something that I think in our Western concept, we really get into hand on the steering wheel every 15 feet. And again, that turns into an endless debate and dialogue that keeps us from making the decision on how to handle Iran. But it does employ a lot of talking heads.
Yeah. Here's a good question that I'll pose to each of you is, put this moment in the Middle East in the context of the history of the Middle East, right? And all the violence that we've seen, over the past decades. How does this moment compare to other significant moments in the past? Emile, why don't you start?
It is different, this moment, regardless, not just because of October 7, but because of the reality that has emerged from there. And one point is that the Arab states, even though they were in the process of more rapprochement with Israel, now have made it clear that rapprochement depends of some settlement of the Palestinian situation. That is kind of new, and that is a result of October 7. The second point is that as long as the occupation continues in the West Bank, there is not going to be a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, because the two choices that Israel faces with that occupation are, one, either to end the occupation or give Palestinians under occupation Israeli citizenship. Well, Israeli governments have not accepted either choice. So the question is, how can you resolve this conflict without ending the Israeli occupation in the West Bank. And I go back to the point that I made initially, that you cannot really look at Gaza in isolation. You've got to look at Gaza in the larger Palestinian and Arab context. It's very telling, just the final point, Michael, is that this recent poll shows that 97% of all those polled across the Arab world in this public opinion poll stated that the Palestine issue now is an Arab issue. Of course, we minimize the Arab street and so on, but leaders, no matter how dictatorial, they tend to listen to their people over time.
Yeah. Rodney?
Michael, so great question. I do think, we probably oversimplify saying, well, this is different, this is distinct, this is bigger, this is worse. But in this case, I really do believe there's something, if this continues, the scales continue to tip toward sort of the directions we've primarily talked about, I do believe somehow this is, in fact, separate from what we've seen thus far. And an example, there are lots of little bits and pieces here we haven't talked about that are so important. You just run out of time. But as an example, what Hamas scored in part on October 7th, and we've written about this, is they not only stopped the Saudi-Israeli rapprochement in sort of its tracks, but they made everybody else stop and start to sort of reverse course. And so it's this sort of, tectonic plate shift from these movements over the decades toward more and more sort of, normalization to now actually probably starting to go back the other way. Perhaps that's wrong, especially with some of the original signees, but I think we should keep an eye on that. The other thing I would say, Michael, is that I think this is going to represent, sort of looking forward and trying to assess and analyze what's going to happen looking out. I believe that what we're now going to see and what we should expect is a massive sort of uptick in, covert, cyber, and similar types of warfare and operations that take us into new areas. I remember that a director of one of the big intelligence organizations in Israel used to use this analogy, and he would equate, and it's sort of weird to follow, but it's like a building, and there were all these different floors, and when you got up to the very, very top, that would be war. And it would be just horrific because the pressures, the violence would crush, everything in its wake. In other words, if you went to war. But what you needed to do was be able and be willing to escalate all the way up, including, way up near the top, to try to prevent that war and take all these steps. And what he was talking about, this escalation floor by floor, was sort of more and more dire types of, warfare that I was just talking about, which don't involve sort of troops sort of standing across the battlefield, firing, even like they have right now in Gaza in many cases. It involves sort of covert cyber and other types of warfare, low intensity conflict and other things, and goes well beyond just sort of the battlefield. And I just really think that this sort of escalatory ladder, we're going to see that play out in all sorts of ways, especially in the shadows.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Norm, let me ask you another question here that's been posed, which is really about the risk of terrorism against the U.S., Israel, other Western states who are supportive of Israel, from Iran or Hezbollah somewhere in the world, deniable attack. How do you think about that risk? And then maybe I'll ask Emile, how do you think about the impact that all of this has on extremism and another generation, right, of extremists emerging as a result of this? Norm, why don't you go first?
Your comments on terrorism are appropriate. We also need to consider the issue of lone wolf attacks based upon either direct propaganda from adversaries and aggressors, or just what they're seeing in the news in general. To just slide a little bit into Emile's question, from Asia to sub-Saharan Africa, people are looking at the uncurated videos taken by Palestinians on the scene, as well as the nature of television in the region, and it is conveying a very different emotion. to touch on the issue of where we stand in general, we're in a hinge point. But the hinge point is important to realize it moves in two directions. The Middle East has not seen this level of violence really since the Second World War. We've had wars against Israel, but we haven't had so many fragile states waiting to, it could be damaged. We don't talk about Jordan much. We don't talk about Egypt much, but we have these new issues. At the same time, a hinge moves in another direction. There are opportunities here. We had the peace process that Henry Kissinger started, and whatever your views are on Secretary Kissinger, that has stayed in place for 50 years. And this is an opportunity for that hinge with the right policymaker push to transform this into something else. It was after the 73 war, and Sadat, not so long historically after that, is in Israel. I mean, this is an extraordinary opportunity moment as well as a push. However, we can't expect, just how the weight of the world works, more bad things to happen than good things. Good things will be rare, more significant, and take time. Terrorism will pop up here and there, but it won't shift strategic thinking of policymakers, but it'll capture the news and capture the zeitgeist of the people.
Yeah, let me finish out here with my own question. You know, we started this conversation by talking about the psyches of the players in the region. I want to ask about how you all see the psyche of America here. You know, one of the things that has struck a number of people is that 30 American citizens died here. A number of American citizens were taken hostage, and nobody in the leadership in the United States, you know, whether it's the administration or its senior members of Congress, have stood up and said, you know, this can't stand, right? So what do you think? What do you think about our psyche here as we look at this? Do we want to run away from this as fast as we can? You know, how do you think about how we think about it? Norm, why don't you start?
We're stuck dealing with it, and that means there will be certain activities that we can avoid and some we can't. The administration and others have chosen not to say, we're going to find the people who killed 30 Americans horribly and took others prisoners, and we're going to bring them to the severest possible justice. And that has happened every time we've had a terrorist incident in the past. And just because they're Palestinian should make no difference. In fact, Hamas was a terrorist organization, declared such since 1997. At the same time, the United States' actions are louder than its words. And it's easy to talk about our polarization. Again, talking heads will go on about that for years, and all the words, and we're not what we used to be, or we are what we used to be. The United States has an enormous military presence in the Red Sea right now. Not China, not Russia, not France, not Europe. And that we're putting American lives on the line. And also, there hasn't been a pushback from the American people against doing that. So on certain large movements that really touch our national interests, I see that playing out. But it is a fascinating issue. How is it that terrorism that killed innocent people is no longer the great war of our time?
Emile?
I'm very concerned about terrorism, the rise of terrorism. And the reason I say this is because the Hamas radicals and other Arabs, according to this public opinion poll, views now the United States as the far enemy. That is, not only they viewed Israel as the near enemy, but now they view the United States as the far enemy, which is very similar to what bin Laden did and spoke about, that you have two enemies, the near enemy and the far enemy. And so that worries me, in that you see a new generation of radicals who will accept this view, and therefore they begin to talk about the United States as a legitimate target. And that we have not paid much attention to that, and I think we should. And the second thing is that what Norm talked about, the peace process, that was correct in the last 50 years when we were viewed as a peacemaker, if you will, as unbiased actor in the region. Now the view is that the United States is viewed as no longer a peacemaker, but as almost a combatant on the side of Israel. And this is very worrisome to me.
Rodney, you get the last word.
So, Michael, I'm going to probably say two things very quickly. One is one of my biggest concerns about what's happening in the Middle East right now is that, notwithstanding all the sort of extremists, terrorists, and others that have long been able and long been upsetting sort of any progress toward peace, toward stability, toward normalized relations, across the board. I think now is a particularly fragile moment, because it seems to me that a lot of these extremists, notwithstanding the opportunities, which I agree absolutely with Norm, we have to look to and try to take, that they can turn the knobs a little this way, a little that way, and just sort of destroy, upset, set back, these sort of what we think of as progress, what we want as progress. And then the other point I'm going to make is, Michael, given that you're the author of the book, and we've worked with you so long on counterterrorism issues and others, and I'd love to hear what you think about the American psyche in this conversation, because I think that's sort of invaluable. You've seen it all and over decades, and so if you don't mind, can I sort of give it back to you and ask you for the last word?
Yeah, I really worry that we don't have the will, we don't have the energy for what it's going to take to, really lead in the management of this crisis. You guys eloquently talked about what has to happen in Gaza, and the whole time you were talking, I was thinking, okay, who's going to manage that? Who's going to lead that? And I only know one country that can do that, and I'm not sure it's willing to expend the energy to do it. So, Larry, let's go back to you.
Well, great. That was a depressing end note there, Michael, but it is a very depressing subject. I want to thank Rodney. I want to thank Emile. And I want to thank Norm, especially Norm, who is now past, I think, 4 a.m. in the morning over in the Middle East. So I appreciate you all taking your time, sharing the expertise that you've shared with world leaders, with American leaders, with the American business community, with our audience. It's invaluable. Michael, wonderful job moderating as always. For those interested in Hayden Center events, we will have our next event on the 1st of February. It will be live and in person in the auditorium at the Schar School in Arlington. We will also live stream it on YouTube, as we do with all of our events. So stay tuned for that. It's going to focus on open source intelligence, the discipline. What does it mean? How is the government doing it? How is the corporate world doing it? Are there ways it can be done better and different? So stay tuned for that. And with that, I wish everybody a good evening, and I wish Norm a good morning. Thank you.